one theologian who said that all theology is really poetry. It's not
Huh.
science. And so
Wow.
I think that, when you look at, if you come at from that perspective to start with, I think it's absolutely true. And so the language of theology tends to be more metaphor, more poetry, more, and when you talk about spiritual, quote unquote, or language,
Hmm.
I think that you can take something like what Thomas Berry, called the Great Story, or
Right. Right.
Mary Evelyn Tucker and Brian Swim called the Journey of the Universe. It is a mythic story, and it is full of wonder and awe that is, you know, is unsurpassed. I mean, I love the quote from Brian Swim that, the deep truth about matter is that molten rocks over the course of 4 billion years transformed themselves into monarch butterflies, blue herons, and the exalted music of Mozart. I mean, if that's not,
Wow.
awe-inspiring, I'm not sure what is. And
It's
once they kind of encounter religious naturalism, a lot of them start identifying as religious naturalists, and certainly, a lot who don't identify specifically, but just kind of have a consider themselves a UU, would consider themselves, in the same theological spectrum of, venerating nature and the sacredness of nature. But I also see that in all sorts of religious people, every, variety of Christianity and Buddhist and so forth, and atheist and very humanistic people.
so I have never done this before. So
Okay,
thank you for offering your time for me to try this out. And so I obviously came across your sermon that was delivered late December, and I just wanted to pick your brain a bit, if that's all right.
sure. Sounds good.
So first off, tell me about yourself. So how did you get to where you are today, being a Unitarian minister?
Okay. Well, it was definitely a circuitous route, to say the least. I spent most of my career of about 30 years in information systems and engineering. Most recently, I worked, before I became full-time minister, for 16 years at Hasbro Toy Company as an applications development manager for data warehousing. So something very different from ministry, but I was already
Interesting.
doing part-time ministry there in the New England area for about 6 years before committing to full-time ministry in 2020 and moving out to Idaho Falls, where I became their full-time settled minister. So prior to that, my background, I've always been kind of a diverse interest. I was always good with science and technology, and in high school, in prep school, and in college. The But I was also interested in history and religion and philosophy, and so I was reading a lot of Eastern philosophy even in high school, especially Buddhism and Taoism, and that continued on into college. And I was fortunate. I went to a prep school that offered a lot of AP classes, so I came into Vanderbilt with basically as a sophomore, so I had a lot of freedom in my first couple of years of choosing classes, and so I took a lot of anthropology and philosophy and things. Even though I was technically an electrical engineering major when I started, I'd end up with a physics degree. And when I graduated, because I soon realized that I was more drawn to the more esoteric areas of physics than I was the practicality of electrical
Interesting.
engineering. And so, like I said, I took a lot of anthropology and the philosophy of science and things like that as well, and some religion courses. And that's also when I started attending a Unitarian church for the first time. I was raised Methodist, and as a child, and then kind of drifted away during my high school years. And then in college, I was, as a physics major, I was very interested in nuclear weapons issues and nonproliferation. And so they happened to be meeting the local St. Freeze group at the Unitarian Church near the Vanderbilt campus. And so that's where I first went over to a Unitarian church, and I'd heard of them, but I just, hadn't explored it very much. And
Hmm.
started looking at some of the pamphlets on the, the welcome table things, and ended up starting to go to church there on Sundays. And it was a wonderful experience, and met a
Awesome.
lot of good people. And that's kind of how I kind of fell into the Unitarian Universalism. Then, like I said, after college, I spent most of my career. I decided I was already starting graduate courses in physics before I decided I really didn't want to do a PhD program, and specialize in something. So I moved on, kind of fell into IT, which I've always been good at for many years. And then about 2006, I guess it was, I started taking some seminary classes just to explore the idea. I'd already been interested in religion and feeling a kind of a tug toward ministry around that time. And so I decided eventually to commit to full-time seminary or part-time seminary. I was still working all the way through seminary and completing internships and that sort of thing until finally, like I said, I graduated in 2013 and then started serving a lot of churches part-time around Massachusetts and Vermont, and living in Rhode Island, working for Hasbro. And so, I knew I wanted to go into full-time ministry, and then everything just kind of came together well for me to go into search and 2019, and then 2020 I began serving this church. So
That's awesome. So like your heart's been kind of in this from Central College days, really, and yet that
yeah,
exposure you had kind of helped expand your worldview and get you interested in these subjects.
yes, absolutely. And like I said, I tell people it wasn't exactly your, St. Paul road to Damascus conversion, but it was more of like a gradual. I described it to one of my mentors once as kind of like a stone in your shoe that you just can't ignore, and you just kind of keeps reminding you. And then the more I got into it, I did a lot of lay preaching and such before I started actually going to seminary, and people kept telling me you should be a minister. And so, when you hear that often enough, it kind of confirms what you've already been thinking, and so here I am. So
That's great. That's really interesting. You had like a background in the corporate world and technology, and just like you said, that the stone in your shoe is always kind of pulling you back to like maybe I should do
mhm,
this with my adult life here. But that's pretty cool. I like the pathway you had there to get to where you are.
mhm.
So coming back to the sermon you gave is in December. I think I found it on YouTube. I just happened to be looking for things like a week after you posted it, pretty much.
Huh,
Um,
okay.
and so I'm kind of curious, like what inspired you to give this sermon on this subject? And would you say this is like a departure from what you normally preach in your church, or kind of along that same theme?
I would say it's more along the same thing. We the church here in Idaho Falls was founded in 1954, but mostly by scientists and engineers from the Idaho National Laboratory, which is
Interesting.
still a huge employer here. It does all kinds of research on nuclear reactors and everything else. And I had a very kind of science literate group, as well as the fact that we live here just an hour and a half from Yellowstone and the Tetons and everything. Is a very outdoorsy crowd as well. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of interest in, hiking, backpacking, and nature and skiing in the wintertime and everything. So you have a combination of very science literate folks, as well as people who find nature inspirational and love to be out in nature. And so I found that, not, as soon as I started preaching here, and even in my candidating, I started talking about my appreciation for nature
Hmm.
and kind of my own outdoorsiness. And that's one of the things that drew me to accept their call here in Idaho Falls. And those kinds of things really resonated with my congregation. Any kind of discussions. I did one of my early sermons I did was on what lichens can teach us about theology and some things like
Oh
that. So,
wow.
so I do a lot of nature-oriented things. In fact, this past Sunday I just did one called "The Transient and Permanent in Biology," and it was
Interesting. Okay.
play on the words of Theodore Parker's famous sermon on Christianity, but it was about the cicadas that are emerging right now, and the different lifespans in biology, and how we can kind of approach things. So things like that have always been very well received. I do try to be very broad in my preaching,
Hmm.
and cover all kinds of topics, mysticism and history and feminism and social justice issues and all those sorts of things you typically hear in a Unitarian church. But I do seem to, at least once or twice a month, I'll do something that's more natural oriented, on some topic on mass extinctions or climate change or
Hmm.
whatever it can
Yeah.
be. But I also do a lot, like I said, like the cicadas, just celebrating life in the interdependent web of existence as well. And I've also found that the classes I've done on, I did one on green spirituality, and I did a book group using braiding sweetgrass book, and so there's a lot of things like that that are
Okay.
good, well received and stimulate people. So they tend to like the nature sermons, and this is the only one though that I've ever done that was specifically laying out the case for religious naturalism, as the
Right.
sermon
Right.
title implied. And I've alluded to it before, but never tried to just say, here it is. And it was very interesting. After that sermon, I had a lot of people come up to me and say, "So that's what I am. I've always I didn't have a word to a label to attach to myself, but I'm a religious naturalist." I said, "Well,
Right.
congratulations, yeah." But so that's kind of that.
No, that's amazing. That's kind of it's funny people's reaction to that because that's kind of my take for a while is that I used to identify as an atheist for years and years
Mhm.
until someone put the terms into words and I was like, huh, that does make sense. Huh,
Mhm.
interesting. So it's just the vocabulary helps, and
Yeah.
that's it's really fortunate. It seems like you found the perfect church to be a minister at because of the congregation with the science background and the appreciation for nature. So like, it's really light up nicely for you there, I'd say.
Yeah,
So
especially the physics undergrad definitely comes in handy with a bunch of physicists in my
oh yeah, you can talk
congregation.
shop with
So,
them, at least
oh
familiarity
yeah,
and stuff. Yeah,
yep,
that's pretty cool. I bet those are pretty nice conversations after church some days.
oh yeah, there's some great ones.
Great. Let's see. The next question I had here was, so would you describe yourself as a religious naturalist?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think that like most Unitarian Universalist, for years, you just asked me, I would say I'm a Unitarian Universalist, but that doesn't tell you much at all about my theology, or tells you more about my political leanings probably than it does about my theological leanings, as I like to say. But I consider myself a UU religious naturalist. If
Hmm.
I wanted to expand the label, just that's the context within which I do my theological exploration and spiritual journey is in I like the Unitarian Universalist community, but I'd say if I had to pick a label, it was that. I've certainly been influenced by other spiritual paths, like I mentioned, about Taoism and Buddhism in
Hmm.
particular, and I
Hmm.
see a lot of overlap in, especially with Taoism and religious naturalism. And so, that's, it's all part of the journey, but I would say that my dominant theology is certainly religious naturalism.
Of course. And so I guess it goes without saying that you would feel like a spiritual connection with nature.
Oh, absolutely. And I spent a lot of times backpacking and
Hmm.
canoeing over the years. My wife and I hiked on the Appalachian Trail in 1992, and so I spent 5 months out there in one stretch, which is the most I've ever spent. But I've spent that time in Alaska and the Rockies and all over the eastern seaboard, and especially the Appalachians. And so I've always felt most spiritual in nature. And in fact, I tell people the only times I felt a kind of an epiphany, if you will, was in sitting on a mountaintop in Maine one time on the Appalachian Trail and just feeling an overwhelming sense of oneness with everything.
Hmm.
It was
Yeah.
very fleeting, but it was the only time in my life I've ever just felt completely dissolved into some kind of a mystical, connection to everything around me. And I think it was just the setting, the isolation of the wilderness, and just the
Yeah.
beautiful day, and just having been out there long enough that I was very attuned to my surroundings in a way that it's hard to get to unless you spent months in the woods like that. And so just I've always appreciated nature. I grew up out in the country and just south of Chattanooga, Tennessee, in North Georgia at the foot of the mountains. And so, as a child, I would spend just hours every day out in the woods on my own, or
Oh,
with
it's
one of my
amazing.
cousins or something. And so I got it, kind of grew up a very privileged lifestyle of being able to do that. My parents had no qualms about just seeing me go out the door, and I'd be back at dinner time, or got hungry
Yeah.
or whatever, it started raining or something. But so I spent a lot of time just in nature as a child, and we had another farm we had down in at the foothills of Pigeon Mountain, which was named for the now extinct passenger pigeon, which used to fly over in huge
Right. Right.
flocks and roost there. And so that farm was in the mountains and had waterfalls and things. And so I really, grew up at spending a lot of time doing that and continuing doing it, hiking, backpacking, and so forth, into college and beyond. And my wife and I, once we got married, we were already backpacking together before we got married, and so we've continued doing that. And like I said, mostly in the East, but now it was nice to have the opportunity to move out west and spend the last few years in we live in the Snake River Plain next to you can see the Teton Mountains from our porch, and so it's kind of nice to be that close to big wilderness areas like Idaho has.
Wow, you're really fortunate to have that be so close, and especially your childhood. It sounds idyllic with just being able to explore what you want to
Mhm.
do and having that area to be free in, really.
Yeah, still haven't gotten used to
Yeah.
the grizzlies yet, but
Oh,
in mountain lions, that's
well,
those are things you didn't have to worry about in the Appalachians. But that's still you're more a part of the food chain here if you go into the backcountry than you are. But I got used to that a little bit when I was hiking in the Rockies in Alaska, seeing all the bears around. But there are quite a few around these parts, and occasionally they wander into we're
right.
kind of on the outskirts of town, and we'll see antelopes and an occasional moose or something wanders into town. So it's pretty rugged, not too far from here.
I'm kind of in a denser city area, so the biggest wildlife I see is a raccoon or a rabbit every now and then. But
Well, we lived in Providence area for 16 years, and so I got used to very densely populated, state of Rhode Island. I lived has some nice wild places, but this is a very different rural kind of little towns in eastern Idaho. Idaho Falls is like 60,000 people, I think, and
okay.
versus there's about 1 million in Rhode Island, and
Oh,
so
yeah.
there's about 1 million in all of Idaho. It's a much bigger place, but
Wow, just because obviously just much more space.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. So coming back to what you said about when you were on the Appalachian Trail and you felt that sense of oneness with nature,
Hmm.
I've I've I can relate to having that being a fleeting feeling. 'Cause unfortunately it takes a lot of time to somehow disconnect from your own thoughts and
Hmm.
to not let everything around you that's the built world just kind of control
Yes.
your thinking, and just to be there is definitely a great experience to have when you can. It helps to
It's
be around nature.
yeah, absolutely. I typically find if I go on a true backpacking trip, it takes me about 3 days before I can finally settle
Yeah,
down, that's when you can stop waking up constantly at every little sound and things. You start, getting into the rhythms of nature a little bit more. It's unfortunate. It's hard for me these days to, have times for long trips where it gives me
yeah,
that time to get into the swing. It's usually 3 or 4 day trips, front country camping and day hiking or whatever, and those are nice, and I can certainly appreciate the nature I'm encountering, but it's not nearly the same to like you said. You have to kind of get all that internal chatter settled down and get kind of to where you're noticing things. I remember one of the things that for a long time, even right after I came back off the trail, I could always tell when it's going to rain in an hour or two because you can start feeling
oh yeah,
just the change in the weather, the subtle breezes and things like that. And and when
and
I was out
smell.
on the trail, I remember watching the ants moving their eggs to higher ground, knowing that, well, here in about an hour it's going to start raining, because the ants can tell you, if you happen to see them moving their eggs out into cover and so forth. And so, we could almost get to the point where I could predict exactly when it was going to rain or snow. And I kind of have lost that over the years, just after you get back to, being in a climate controlled environment in your car and things like
Yeah,
that.
I mean we adapt to our environment. We've built up an artificial environment around us, so it's
Mhm.
kind of funny how those trips that you occasionally get to go out in nature, that used to be the 100% of the time
Mhm.
for people long time
Yep.
ago, and now it's like a special treat that you have to drive to. It's
Yep.
interesting times we live in. So coming back to something that you mentioned in your sermon is that you mentioned that religious naturalism is a real and viable theology, but yet there's not a church religious naturalism.
Mhm.
Could you quite expand on what you mean by that? And I'm kind of a novice when it comes to these subjects, and so like maybe I don't get the terms properly, but like, what would you say the difference is between like a church religious naturalism and a theology of religious
Okay.
naturalism?
Yeah, I would say that right now, at least, there's no institutionalized religious
Okay.
naturalism. So we have, so there's a kind of a subgroup of UU clergy that are, religious naturalists and have discussions on Facebook and that sort of thing. There's also the Religious Naturalist Association, obviously, but there's no institutionalized, denomination, if you will, of religious naturalism. It's more of individuals within certain faith traditions. I think the Unitarian Universalists have a larger percentage probably than most denominations, just because we have a lot of people who are avowedly humanist or nature spirituality, and once they kind of encounter religious naturalism, a lot of them start identifying as religious naturalists, and certainly a lot who don't identify specifically, but just kind of have a consider themselves a UU would consider themselves in the same theological spectrum of venerating nature and the sacredness of nature. But I also see that in all sorts of religious people, every variety of Christianity and Buddhist and so forth, and atheist and very humanistic people. So there's no organized institution of religious naturalism, at least
Right.
yet. Although I think that some churches, like my own, may start having a more dominant flavor of theology that is religious naturalism. You see that a lot in the U world. When you go to certain churches, will have a more humanistic, kind of a theology that's dominant. Some will have a kind of a liberal Christian. A very few still have a kind of a liberal Christian perspective,
Hmm.
mostly. There's a handful that are even, served by pagan, Wiccan priests or priestesses that are also UU
Interesting.
ministers, and so they'll have a very distinctive kind of neo-paganism. And so I think that you'll start seeing more and more of this kind of religious naturalism creeping into the UU movement, and it's my personal theory on this. But I don't think you'll see I think you'll see certain like liberal Christian churches like UCC and Episcopal churches, a lot of them, you'll have ministers who are very much religious naturalists and very inspired by, some of the great Christian naturalist, theologians and so forth, as well as non-Christians. And so it's hard to say. I think, like I said, I don't know that there'll ever be a, church of religious naturalism per
Yeah.
se. And part of it is because, a lot of the religious naturalists are very atheistic. And so, they're seldom drawn to churches per se, especially the name church. I mean, a lot of
Hmm.
churches call themselves congregations or fellowships or whatever, because they even eschew the traditional language of being a church.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
that's not as common now as it was a few years ago, but trends come and go, so hard to say.
So that's been my kind of what I've been gathering too. Like it's more of a kind of a viewpoint and an identity thing necessarily than a like a like a doctrine or a dogma necessarily. And what you mentioned about the and many atheists being religious naturalists or believing the label applies to them is it's interesting because yeah, you don't really have a church of a congregational church of atheism necessarily. Like that's
Sure.
many people who identify that have purposely chosen to not go to church because of either poor experiences or connotation or just disinterest. And it's
Mhm.
interesting to see if we could if it'd be interesting to see if there is a kind of more of a movement perhaps springing from the Unitarian Universalism that does kind of create a church that is more focused around religious naturalism. But
Mhm.
I guess we'll find out.
Yeah,
We'll see what
and
happens.
typically, UUs tend to be almost pathological about ecclesiastical authority, and so we're very independent congregations for the most part.
Yeah.
So it'd be hard to see. I could see a growing religious naturalist of UU movement within the UUA, but there's also, you could make the same case for there's probably about 20 or so percent of all UUs now consider themselves Buddhist, and so
Right.
It's almost its own sect of Buddhism as well within the UU world. So, and individuals in our individual congregations tend to be very different sometimes in their theological perspectives as well. So it's hard to say just because of our pushback against any kind of organizational here's this big wave that's coming through. We're all going to become religious naturalists.
Right.
But I
Right.
could go back historically and say, look what happened with humanism, because liberal Christianity has become very, very much a minority position within Unitarian Universalism, and it was supplanted mostly by humanism beginning in the 1800s when you get through transcendentalism and then kind of exploring the Eastern religions in the late 1800s and into the up to the time of the Humanist Manifesto, which had so many Unitarian and a few Universalist signers of that.
Hmm.
It became the dominant theology of the whole movement, certainly through the 1950s and 60s. But I think we're in the beginning of the 70s and 80s, we've kind of gotten a little more diverse, little, some kind of new age thinking, as well as neo-pagans and things like that, as well as a lot of interest in Buddhism, especially after the Second World War and all the, again, kind of the growing Buddhist movement across
Hmm.
America. And so, yeah, it's hard to say. Like I said, one thing you can certainly be wrong about is predicting anything about religious, transformation, because,
Yeah. Yeah.
they were preaching the end of religion in the 1960s, and then you have the rise of fundamentalism, in the 70s and 80s. So, the church has certainly not gone away, and unfortunately, in some cases, have some very fundamentalist views on the
Hmm.
resurgence these days that are counter to science and everything else. So yeah, it is what it is. But I do believe that we have a fertile soil, let's put it that way, for growing religious naturalism as a theological perspective within Unitarian Universalism.
Okay. Awesome. So it's kind of the interesting, just the nature of what Unitarian Universalist Church tries to do is be very accepting, and kind of as a consequence of that, you're kind of like herding cats in a way.
Yeah.
You can't quite
Oh, it's a
hand down an ideology necessarily if you're trying to be more accepting. It's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge of being that inclusive, and it's certainly a challenge for Unitarian ministers. I'll tell you to, I'm very, very cognizant of every word I choose in a sermon, just because I try to think of the perspective of someone who's never been to our church before,
Right.
someone who's the oldest member of the church, somebody who's got a completely different theology than I do, and make sure there's nothing that's going to offend. At least if I don't mind challenging people and putting stuff out there to to consider and to
Of course.
maybe this is something you want to explore, is the way I kind of come at it. But it is a challenge to cover that broad spectrum. And that's why I tend to try to balance out my nature-oriented sermons with things that are more appealing to some other person on a different Sundays.
I'm sure that's no small task, and but if you've been doing it for this long, you must have a good knack at it.
I
Yeah.
think I do. I get told that people like my sermons and they like the variety, and every now and then you'll get somebody who'll come up to you after in coffee hour and try to challenge you on something
Mhm.
their perspective. And so I'm generally very appreciative listener when I talk to these people and engaging in conversations. And even around here in Idaho is a very conservative state, and we're
Yes.
unfortunately the politics here are horrible, but we're also surrounded by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So we have a huge Mormon population here. And so when you go to something like a Pride booth and set up and represent the church, you'll have some
Right.
interesting conversations with people who've come there to protest the Pride booth. And so,
I,
it keeps you on your toes, and it
yeah.
sharpens your theological thinking at least. So, but
So
I try to be friendly and welcoming to anybody's opinion, and I'll hear them out. I mean, I'd agree with them, and I may push back, but unless they're being obnoxious, we try to be very welcoming and understanding. So,
of course, I mean that's how it's kind of your role as a minister. It's all
yeah.
part of making connections, talking with people, listening. I'm kind of curious though. So obviously Utah, there is the large Mormon presence. Have you had conversations with Mormons who are sympathetic to the religious naturalist worldview, is there kind of like an overlap there too, or just is it not really something you discussed much with many people?
I would say that we have several come outers from Mormon Church in our congregation, and a lot of them are attracted to kind of a religious naturalist perspective.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of them are, basically deconstructing their, the religion of their tradition of their birth, and so
Right.
they're open to about anything. And so, I have a lot of good conversation, but there are a lot of very nature oriented people. Uh, I haven't had any conversations like that specifically with current Mormon, believers. Uh, Even though I have interacted a lot with things like we have the Idaho Falls Interfaith community and so forth, and we do have representation from the LDS church in that group, and have a really good relationship with one of the he's the bishop who is in charge of like outreach and communication. So he's not associated with a specific church, but he participates in the interfaith community. He came to
Cool.
my installation service and things like that. So we have a good working relationship, but we've never had the conversation about religious naturalism. I do know that a lot of the Mormons around here are very outdoorsy people, and so they love to go out into nature. They ride ATVs. They hunt and fish and everything
Mm.
else. And so, this whole area is, extremely, wilderness kind of oriented. And so you see a lot of interesting politics when it comes to things like, there's an effort right now to remove dams on the Snake River and into the
Okay.
Columbia River watershed. And you'll see very conservative groups joining hands with Native American tribes and liberal conservation groups and things on the same effort because they have that appreciation for
Right.
nature and for and they see, yes, we need to restore salmon populations. Some people just want it because that's more fish to catch, but a
Yeah.
lot of people just understand that the ecosystem needs to be intact. And there's even a lot of pushback from some of these groups on things like right now there's a big fight about wolf relisting here in Idaho.
I've
They
heard about that.
reinstated
Yeah.
wolf hunting, and in fact, I just had someone come across my Facebook feed this morning about the fact that 398 wolves have been killed in the last year in Idaho alone,
Mm.
including pups, and it's just
Yeah.
horrendous mismanagement of the biology. And so you'll get some people from the Mormon Church and so forth that are actively involved with those kind of environmental issues. Uh, they're still as committed to their religion as ever, but they do have that appreciation for nature. So that's kind of, I would call that, some of that's religious naturalist thinking, because they're seeing the bigger picture of the ecosystems and the relationships we have with other species and so forth. But they're still firmly in their faith, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. I would rather have those kind of allies than not, certainly. So, but you do have a lot of people who are on the other side of the fence as well, just, very traditional thinking. And so it's a challenge, but I can't recall ever having that with any non-UUs in this area, but I don't get a lot of opportunities, honestly, to speak to other faith people outside the interfaith community. We're generally doing something specific to the community food basket or something like that. So there's not a lot of conversation on environmental issues.
The so it's just kind of funny how you mentioned like just by virtue of people spending more time outdoors and being closer to nature, like those concerns about preserving the biosphere, about protecting endangered species, like those transcend normal political alignments just because you can't ignore it if you're seeing it. Um, you kind of have to wonder like how much more of ecologically minded people would be if they just went on a walk every now and then.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I mean, I preach that all the time. I tell people to get out, and even just the local city park, and just go sit in the park and just listen to the birds, look at the things around you, feel the breeze. I've
yes.
a lot of things. One of the things I love to do around here is my wife and I'll drive up to Yellowstone, and there's some big open areas, meadows, and so forth, where you can see big herds of bison. And especially in the
Oh,
springtime when they
cool.
have calves, it's nice to just, I bring a long chair and I'll just sit there for hours and usually with binoculars or spotting scope, and just watch the bison move around and just enjoy being out there. I don't have to be hiking or doing anything. I can be, 50 feet from my car, sitting in a lawn chair and just observing the what they call red dogs, the little calves running around. It's fantastic this time of year to see the big herds and just against that backdrop and the rivers and things. So there's plenty that people can do just being out in nature. I've done some formal forest bathing practices and such as
Okay,
well,
cool.
and that's something I'm trying to introduce at my congregation, is to start taking groups of people in. We have a little peace garden area that's outside the church, and so even just going to that space and appreciating some of the teachings of forest bathing, and just touching trees and experiencing nature itself is good. And like I said, fortunately, I don't have to do a lot with folks. I'm mostly aiming this toward the elderly members, which is very common in church to have a lot of elderly, and so people can't get out and do big trips into nature anymore. Just try to get out and do some small things and just appreciate that. So, but every age from children through as old as you are, I think can benefit from time in nature, and it tends to reconnect us intuitively with that kind of spiritual connection to the earth and to all life. And so you don't need to read a book or anything, just spend more time. And like I said, it just does something. I think deep down we feel it more than we have to intellectually know it. So it's
Well,
kind of
yeah,
mystical in that way. So
well, it's definitely like I mentioned earlier, is that this whole built up and artificial environment we have around us, these houses, air conditioning, this is all pretty recent stuff. And so most of human history, you were just outside. It wasn't even
mhm.
called outside. It was just
Yeah,
called where you
there's
were. It's
there's
home.
no such thing as wilderness, per se.
Just what was
It's like
around you.
it's home. So
Yeah.
it's in some places we're wilder than others. It's like
Yeah, of course.
here out in the Rockies, you think about the high peaks and things that the Native Americans rarely ever went into these very hostile terrain, and they had their
Right.
places where they hunted, and they had places where they lived, and they moved around according to the seasons. But going on up into the Teton range, that was something that maybe a shaman or somebody else might do for spiritual quest, but that's not where the people went. And so they would think that was a wild place, but what we would consider wilderness, they called home, like you said. So it's
Yeah.
I think
My
there's a lot to be said for that.
my my wilderness retreat is when I go to the 1 acre of woods that they didn't cut down to make a parking lot. And we make a plaque and pat ourselves on the back for that one.
Uh-huh.
Versus like you said, Native Americans, they would actually have to, they would always be around wilderness, and a shaman have to climb up a mountain to be alone.
Yep.
That's different times, obviously. Something. My next question actually kind of ties to something you had mentioned earlier when you mentioned how when you're talking to people who are Mormons, actually former Mormons, who are deconstructing their faith.
Mhm.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because like the next question I had was about kind of how religions provide us kind of mythic stories that
Mhm.
provide meaning to our lives and direction. And I don't say mythic in terms of like a derisive thing, like, oh, like it's just mythology, just ignore that
Right.
stuff. Like mythic in terms of like these are narratives that provide moral compasses. They provide answers to life's big question. And then when someone leaves their faith, like you said, those former Mormons in your congregation, like you can feel kind of unmoored, kind of ungrounded. Like
Mhm.
the term that I don't know if you've read him before. The author Loyal Rue coined it as amythia, where
Mhm.
you've rejected the old ideologies in favor of more science and based methods, but we kind of failed to fill in the gaps of what people still need as far as that mythic understanding of who we are.
Mhm.
So I know it's a long-winded intro, but my question of you is, so how would you say that that the stories of biological cosmic evolution, the understanding of nature, all science-based, by the way. How do you think that those can provide those mythic stories, kind of fill that desire?
Well, I agree completely that you need those mythic stories, to have you know that are truths which are kind of universal and
Hmm.
poetic and metaphorical. And I heard one quote, I can't remember who said it. It was one theologian who said that all theology is really poetry. It's not
Huh.
science. And so
Wow.
I think that when you look at, if you come at from that perspective to start with, I think it's absolutely true. And so the language of theology tends to be more metaphor, more poetry, more, and when you talk about spiritual, quote unquote, or language,
Hmm.
I think that you can take something like what Thomas Berry, called the Great Story, or
Right. Right.
Mary Evelyn Tucker and Brian Swim called the Journey of the Universe. It is a mythic story, and it is full of wonder and awe that is, you know, is unsurpassed. I mean, I love the quote from Brian Swim that, the deep truth about matter is that molten rocks over the course of 4 billion years transformed themselves into monarch butterflies, blue herons, and the exalted music of Mozart. I mean, if that's not,
Wow.
awe-inspiring, I'm not sure what is. And, just looking at, and so as a minister, one of the things I do is I try to keep re-emphasizing these things, and we show the Journey of the Universe film and things
Hmm.
like that, and discuss it. We talk about, I talk about the story of evolution often. I talk about the story of human evolution a lot, and talked about the origins of religion and how it goes back, and there's evidence of over 100,000 years at least of human spiritual feelings, and it
Hmm.
probably goes back to millions of years into the Australopithecines and so forth, who first looked at that tree, just got struck by lightning or something, or the night sky, and just said that feeling of wonder and awe, kind of come up. And so I think there's a lot to mine there. I think that it's part of it's just how you tell it, and even with our children, a lot of times we've done children's lessons, and I've got a big poster that I picked up years ago of the tree of life. Basically, it shows all the branching
Oh,
off of
cool.
the various species over time, and going back. And so I like to try to help them connect to things like I did a children's story, for instance, talking about how much we have in common with a mushroom in terms of DNA.
Oh,
And
nice.
looking at here's where fungi branched off, and here's where we are on this long tree of life, and these connections, and starting to make them feel deep time, and that sense of wow, we really are an independent web of all existence, and connected. And so I think a lot of it just has to do with you know, saying it often and poetically and metaphorically, and showing how it can be a mythic story, to use that language, uh, that can inspire you. I mean, like I said, I certainly feel inspired. I mean, I try to get as many people as I can to read Ursula Goodenough's The Sacred Depths of Nature,
Oh,
because
yes,
that's
of
kind of
course.
like one of those. That's a great introduction if you want to understand the history of life, and then read the Journey of the Universe, and things like that. And so I think that more and more that's becoming understood, and people are starting to get that as a new meta narrative, if you will, of this of religious naturalism, and or just whatever green spirituality you come from. And so I think that that's very important. I think the human religion stories are important as well. And so I'll
Hmm.
draw on those as mythic truths as much as I'll draw on, scientific truth, if you will, from the evolutionary biology story. And one thing I like to point out to people is that our great story now changes based on new discoveries all the time. I mean, we're
Hmm.
always, if you look at what's going on with the Webb telescope these days, they're looking at stuff that doesn't fit the standard model of the Big Bang even. And so they're trying to
Yeah.
reconcile cosmology that's been in place for over 100 years, and so it can fundamentally shift our thinking. But that's part of the beauty of a scientific worldview and your mythic story versus dogma, and this is God handing you this text, it can fell out of the sky or whatever. And so there's great mythic truths in the stories of many traditions. And I I use a lot of Native American stories in Our Time for All Ages, just because they're all about, talking animals, having councils and things like that. But there's obvious truths to these stories, no matter what we really know now about, badgers and porcupines or whatever.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so, I think it's all important, and it's all part of evolution. I mean, Wilford Cantwell Smith, who, the late theologian, who had this idea of what he called the cumulative tradition. I mean, and specifically, he's talking about Christian cumulative tradition that accrues over time. I think that all
right.
of this is part of our own cumulative tradition, and we shouldn't be willing to just say, "Well, I have nothing to do with the Bible, the Quran, or whatever," because I'm now, an humanistic, religious, the naturalist or whatever. I think that there's still truths there, to be mined, certainly, and so I don't throw those out. I just kind of incorporate it all into the great story and the great work, as Tom Sperry called it.
Yeah, because if you believe that there's, like you mentioned, going back a long time in human history, perhaps even millions of years ago, like we have evidence to suggest that people have been spiritual and religious for a long, long time. And so
Mhm.
really the religions we have are expressions of that.
Yeah,
So the truth we find in all religions is essentially it's the stories they have staying power because they appeal to people, and that in a sense is like the proof in itself of the value that it persisted for so long. So like
and, and
that's yeah. Go ahead.
and it gives us a look at how different peoples have experienced the sacred in different
Of
ways over
course.
time. And
Yes.
so it opens you to think, that's interesting. I want to learn more about that. It's like, one of the things I've, spent a lot of my time reading, over the years, is a lot of the Christian mystics. And, I look at somebody like Hildegard of Bingen, who was very green in her spirituality, very Christian still, but
Mm,
also talks about the verdancy of the earth and things like that. And so you read that from a Christian perspective. You can look at, Buddhist teachings and, Taoist, poetry and things like that. So there's all kinds of stuff out there, that's worthy of exploration. And I'm glad that I'm in a faith tradition which does that and doesn't, have that singular focus on a particular faith. One major text and, one spiritual sage, that's, and so I get to have that and the other things too, which is what I like. And so that's really what drew me to the Unitarian Universalist faith in the first place.
well, yeah, just of course, obviously the openness to different perspectives, and going back to when you were in school, like you were taking physics and then philosophy courses, like that
Yeah.
mixed together, it kind of like is along the same theme.
It all
Yeah.
ends up being the same thing in the end, is what I tell you. It's like, you get deep enough into physics, it becomes philosophy, and
Yeah.
the mathematicians will argue that it all becomes math ultimately. So, but I got math as the language of the philosophy behind all this. So, it's like the great, spiritual sages of the ages all start to sound alike eventually. It's because it's not limited by a dogmatic, individual religion that they're in. I look at spirituality as the experience of the sacred, and religion is how you express that experience. And so, religion is more of a verb than spirituality is a feeling. And so,
Okay.
I think that's why when you start
Huh.
reading, different sources of the really great mystical thinkers, they all start sounding very similar, and it's hard to say, are they Christian or are they Buddhist or what are they? The answer
They
is
were
they just
human.
are. They're human, and they've reached a
Yeah.
level of understanding the big picture of things. I think you're starting to see that now, and with cosmology and religion, everything kind of coming together and into these kind of amorphous, there's a lot of interdisciplinary stuff right now, things like eco psychology and so forth, where you start having, crossovers between, conservation and biology and psychology and so forth. And so the nice little, Cartesian Newtonian world of, reductionism and compartmentalization doesn't seem to fit as well. We're starting to realize that, kind of a transdisciplinary approach to things is makes more sense. And I think the same thing is true about religion. I think that it's hard to, be exclusivist and have much relevance in the long term. So that's my personal opinion.
Yeah. And if I mean, definitely if you're sticking with a more exclusive worldview, or if you have like more of a dogmatic approach to thing, then you're missing out on a lot of the
Hmm.
ongoing revelation. Um,
Yes.
that like you said, the James Webb Telescope, like we're literally looking at the heavens and getting answers about who we are. Like that's literally
Yeah.
what's happening. And just to just dismiss that is, I feel, is a mistake.
Yeah.
Of course, that's a value judgment on my part.
Yeah.
So kind of circling kind of back to kind of types of religions, is that often there is this kind of sense that religious subjects have to include the supernatural, and that things such as like holiness and the sacred and whatnot, these only apply to spiritual things that are not of this earth, and then when you tie it to earth, then it becomes like corrupted, or et cetera, et cetera. So how, in your, from your perspective, religious naturalists, and also as a UU minister, how would you describe what something is, sorry, let me rephrase that. How would you describe what holiness is, or what the sacred is, if it's not something supernatural? Like how do those words have meaning?
Well, I think, first of all, I'd say that there is a feeling more than a rational knowledge of what we experience as sacred. I think that
Right.
it's a deeply intuitive thing. I talked about in that sermon, I mentioned something about the one surmise, if you will, or supposition that can't be proved, is that we're assuming that nature is worthy of sacred venerance,
Yes.
the veneration. So, it's a matter of, why do I feel that way? I feel that way intuitively and just from my own experience and from everything I've learned and read in life and so forth has gotten me to this point. And I certainly feel that religion exists without supernaturalism. And it drives me nuts when people there's this assumption that, well, religion's when you believe in things which aren't believable because it's supernaturalism and so forth. And
Yeah.
it's like, tell that to a lot of Buddhists out there that have no supernaturalism in their faith, and a lot of Unitarian Universalists and humanists and atheists who are just as religious and just as, venerate the sacred as anybody. I think that the sacred is what appeals to you and inspires that awe and wonder and those
Right.
deep feelings of spirituality, wherever you find it. And so, whether or not you grew up in a tradition that was very dogmatic and that just works for you, great. That's the way you experience it. And like I say, it goes back to my own definitions of spirituality versus religion. And as spirituality is a feeling and an experience of the sacred that you just know when you know it. And then religion is how you express that feeling, whether it's rituals or
Right.
going to Sunday worship or going for a walk in the woods. And one of the things I tell my congregation all the time is, especially this time of year when we're finally starting to warm up a little bit, it's going to
Oh
be
yeah.
about 70 today,
It's
which
beautiful.
it snowed the other day. So we're out here. That's one of the things is you don't get a nice spring. You kind of get kind of a back and forth spring, then you get summer. And so we're getting into the point where it's getting warmer than it is colder. And so I'm not offended when there's very few people in church on the Sunday because everybody's out enjoying the weekend. It's like, I completely understand, and I would probably be out there with you if I didn't have a job to be here preaching, that day. But so I can completely appreciate the people who, feel that they don't need to go to church; they just want to go spend time in nature, and that makes perfect sense to me. Like I said, going into a forest, especially, is where I feel that cathedral of nature feeling.
Mm.
But I also feel it when I go into the great cathedrals in Europe, and when I tour a holy site, that was venerated for 10,000 years or something. There's you can experience the sacred in all kinds of ways, and it evokes strong spiritual feelings. And I think if you're attuned to them, the
Right.
trick is to open yourself to experiencing that, and that's where you can feel that sacredness. And it absolutely does not have to be supernatural. And I get really annoyed when people make that assumption about churches. And I said, you haven't been to one of my churches. So come to a Unitarian church, and I guarantee you can have no sense of atheism, have no sense of spirit of supernaturalism whatsoever. You'll more likely find that majority of the people there don't believe in the supernatural and are some variety of atheist or something else that probably aligns with what you're already feeling. And so yeah, I think it's absolutely like I said, and all you have to do is look at all the varieties of Buddhism that don't have the supernatural
Of
element
course.
to them as well. And there's certainly nothing wrong with it. And I would never judge someone if they truly believe in a supernatural being or deities or
Mhm.
whatever. That's a personal choice. And I know some of my pagan friends are very much in that ballpark, as well as my Christian friends and so forth. But that's just not for me. I don't see the need for it. And the more I know about science, the less room there is for supernaturalism. And so if there's anything mystical and outside of what's known in the universe, I think it's the fact that there's this expansive creativity in the universe, which tends to have a propensity for greater diversity and greater um, organization. It's like, it's the whole, the sacred mystery to me is this ongoing creativity of the universe that has produced this, incredible variety of beings and planets and stars and
Yeah.
entities, and just keeps evolving and into something more and more sophisticated. Now we have, human consciousness and self-reflection, and it's like, I think all animals and plants probably share a degree of sentience of some on some level, but we're the only species we know of so far that can look back at the universe and get to know it. So the universe becomes knowing itself, and so that's
Yes.
just,
Yes.
that's mysterious and awe-inspiring to me. So, we can't explain that completely at this point. That doesn't mean we won't ever, but it's just right now our limited human understanding of that is what's really, the only thing I will cross into the great unknown. And I tell people I just I've made peace with the mystery, and so I live with a certain degree of mystery in my life, and I'm glad, because I think it'd be very boring if there wasn't some sense of mystery, but that ongoing creativity. Yeah, if you want to call that God, like Gordon Kaufman, the late
Mhm.
theologian, did, he called the creativity was, he made it equivalent with his concept of God, coming from I think it was a Mennonite perspective originally, but so I have a lot of appeal to that. If you want to use more traditional language, I'm comfortable with traditional language, but I know a lot of Unitarian Universalists aren't, and so
Okay.
they don't like using words like God, and there's all kinds of jokes that we could go into there, but the but if that feels good to you, fine. If not, you call it nature, call it cosmos, call it whatever you want. But there's an amazing universe we live in, and just an amazing world we live in, and we're just starting to uncover all the intricacies of ecosystem relationships, and things. It's just absolutely amazing. And just like I said, this past Sunday I preached and talked about cicadas,
Yeah.
and just talking about the life cycles and things like that, are just, that alone is enough to spend a lifetime pondering, and without even getting into the big cosmic picture.
Yeah. It's like no matter what you look into, there's this amazing depth to it. You could pick the most random tiny little plant in your yard, and if you took a microscope to it, you would just see all the intricate structures, and you could talk to a biologist who would talk about evolutionary history and all the insects dependent upon it. It just goes on and on and on. And then you can, like you said, like you could break things down mechanistically and look at each individual part, but taken as a whole, it's like, wow, this is all one giant thing, and this is
Yeah.
existing independent of me. I get to observe this.
Hmm.
Um, it's definitely a sense of wonder and awe. And but of course I get what you say, that this isn't like you can't force someone to feel that way. There has to be just something that comes from you, and maybe you can learn how to appreciate better, but ultimately the inspiration just comes naturally.
Hmm.
Um, so kind of shifting towards you mentioned God, um, and this kind of that kind of leads toward the question I had, is that you mentioned during your sermon that a religious naturalist doesn't necessarily fret over the problem of good and evil. Of course, the typical question is like, if God exists and is all good and all powerful, why does evil exist? And could you kind of elaborate what you meant by that? Like, how is that not like a conundrum for the religious
Okay.
naturalist perspective?
Well, I think that, to me, the way I come from it is that I believe that there is good and evil in the world, but it is entirely a human construct,
Mm,
and it involves human behavior.
it's
And
about us.
and so, naturing is neither good nor evil. I think that it just is. And, it
Hmm.
depends on your perspective. I mean, I like to use the example of, if you're a, a deer and you've just given birth to your little uh, baby deer, I'm trying to think, and your fawn, that's what I was looking for. And a wolf comes along and eats your fawn. That's a great moral tragedy and evil from the perspective of the mother deer. But it is nature being nature. A wolf has to eat the fawn's food. It's the circle of life and all that. And
Yeah.
so uh, there was no evil intent on the part of the wolf. The wolf was being true to its own nature. But, human beings have a greater sense of self-reflection and moral guidance and learning that they should know better. And so when you do things
Right.
like, declare war on people or racist or bigotry and things like that, those are moral evils and they are entirely human and they're just as evil as anything that you can concoct, but you're certainly not, the tool of the devil or something like that, nor are, is the wolf, evil for doing this thing. And so I think you have to look at it on different levels. I mean, like the poem says, nature is red in tooth and claw, and that's just a fact. And so we have to accept that, and and appreciate the fact that earthquakes and tidal waves, and great tragedies as they may be, and kill thousands of people, they're
Hmm.
not evil per se. They just are, and it's just we do what we can to eliminate as much of the tragedy as we can. But me killing someone over a dispute is certainly a moral evil, and it comes from that moral plane of human existence. It doesn't have to have a supernatural commandment to say thou shalt not kill. We know intuitively
Yeah.
this is not a good thing,
Personally.
and it's like so it all goes back to the evolution of human moral values, which has
Mm. Hmm.
always been culturally defined. Sometimes slavery was good and sometimes now not so much. We don't think and so it's always been culturally defined, as well as there's a part of its biology, part of its just cultural, and how you get along in society. What are the rules that make societies function, so we're not all killing each other or stealing from each other and so
Yeah.
forth. And so I think that you know that kind of goes into the humanism versus religious naturalism debate a little bit, because there's always this tension between what is human and something apart from pure religious naturalism versus humans as a species among species. And so I think we do have a kind of a separate special status, if you will, in terms of because of our consciousness and our ability for self-reflection and self-awareness. And so we know, for instance, if we're going to mow down a forest and displace all the species there,
Yeah.
we know that what we're doing. Whether or not we think that's morally wrong or not, that's a different discussion. But we've made a choice, and we know the implications of that choice.
Right.
And so we do have a special status there as far as that capacity for self-awareness. And so I think that kind of bleeds over to the whole moral, good and evil piece. But I firmly believe that there is definitely evil in the world, but it's all comes from inside the human soul, as far as decisions we make that that diminish the lives of others.
Yeah.
I like from a natural perspective, I kind of like what Aldo Leopold said about the what's good and what's right and what's wrong. That a thing is right when it tends to preserve the beauty and the stability of what they call the biotic community, and it is
Hmm.
wrong when it tends to do otherwise. And so you can look at it from that perspective if you want to say what's right and wrong in nature. And that there's more of a sense of balance and preservation of the stability of the environment, the ecosystem. That's good versus things that wipe out are bad. They're not necessarily evil. Like I said, a forest fire or a tornado or earthquake or whatever can wipe out entire ecosystems. And that's just unfortunate and tragic, but it's not evil.
Yeah. So it's definitely it all comes down to the actions we take, the choices we make, and like you said, we have the ability to evaluate our decisions, and we can choose to do better. So definitely, like that makes sense to me. Like if you said that a rock sitting in a field is just there, it's not good or evil. But if I were to pick
Right.
up that rock and throw it at someone, you could call that an evil act if I was trying to
Yes.
hurt someone. It comes down to the context of what we were doing to each other, how we're treating each other. So what would you say though? Do you think that people can kind of glean moral direction from nature? I mean, obviously we've been discussing it, but like in general though, like the kind of the pushback I get when I talk about these things is people say like, well, if God didn't tell you to do it, then how do you know it's right? Or like, or if it's just natural, it's all relative. But as far as I see, like everyone's a human being, everyone's on Earth, so there's got to be some grounding to
Yeah.
reality and some basis for morality here.
Yeah, I think that there's certain areas we can certainly find inspiration in nature from a moral perspective, such as looking at, harmony between species and relationships and, understanding, the roles of different species. We've talked about it, how they interact and how important they are to each other. And so we can take away certain things about the importance of recognizing our interdependence on each other and so forth, and extrapolate that kind of to the human plane, if you will. I think other things, like I said, are strictly speaking a human phenomenon. I think that morality in the sense of what's good and evil is definitely limited to the human plane as far as we can tell. I don't. Every now and then you hear of an animal that just kills and seems to have no benefit of the killing, but I would argue that they were just drawn to the attack, and maybe they lost
Instinct.
interest. And it's part of their predatorial instincts, and so I don't think I can't think of a single instance of animals acting with moral evil intent, and so I think there's a limit to what we can learn morality wise from nature, but we can learn some things about balance and the importance of consideration for other species and for each other. We could certainly translate that into, human interdependence as well, and seeing the bigger picture and not just our own tribe or our own country or whatever. I think that, like I said, but there's a limit there. I think that's where the humanist me comes in, and
Hmm.
yeah, it's like late William Murray called himself a humanistic religious naturalist, and I think
Okay.
that's very accurate because he is acknowledging that humanistic piece where you're looking at human justice and values and things like that. But where the tension is how much of that do you lean toward favoring the human as something different
Right.
versus are
Right.
we one among other species? And do we value human life over the needs of the species? In other words, if I had a choice between losing one human and losing an entire species, which is more value? And that becomes a moral question. And so, if you have a relationship with the one person you're losing, you think, oh, they're much more valuable than any species.
Mm.
If that's the choice I have to make. But if you look at the big picture, what happens if that species is gone forever from the web of life, and what are the ramifications all the way through to other life forms? And so those are kind of moral dilemma that kind of gets us out of the strictly what I would call a deep ecological mindset into something a little more humanistic when it comes to moral values. And it's I don't have the answer, obviously. It's like it's an ongoing debate and discussion, and it's like we should have that debate and discussion, and it certainly impacts real world decisions that are happening every day about should we drill in the last Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or should we clear cut this forest or not? Should we mine lithium here in this desert, and what's the
Right.
impact?
Right.
Or should we remove dams on the Snake River, like the discussion? And so there's pros and cons, and so I think that as humans we have to work through those and make the best decisions we can. And those of us who care about the earth and other species have to make our voices heard, because it's too easy to just get locked into that limited human mindset.
Yeah. I feel sometimes like a lot of time when people are debating about morality and whatnot, they get too caught up on these weird edge cases and talk about like XYZ, and when in practical terms, most morality is pretty straightforward. It's like you try not to hurt people, you try not to do dumb things. Like it's very practical in terms of like I don't have to teach my kids necessarily like that it's wrong to hurt someone if they experience the negative consequence of it. Now, granted, some people don't get that lesson, and it helps to give direction. But like a lot of this is kind of intuitive. Like you said, the whole "don't kill" is like, well, I don't want to be killed. I don't want my
Yeah.
friends to get killed, so probably we shouldn't do that.
Well, there's a
Yeah,
reason that the golden rule in some form has emerged in almost every religious tradition or society that, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you.
yeah,
It becomes just self-evident. You don't need a Bible or something to tell you not to do this. It's just part of being an animal and understanding is like,
yeah,
I don't like when people hit me, so I don't think I should hit people and cause pain on them. So, like you said, do we really need, even do we need a parent to tell us this? I mean, I think parenting is a important part of moral guidance and so forth, and that goes to the larger society, parenting, society. And it's what we've learned from generations and generations, and we just got more and more sophisticated and realized that things like abducting our neighbors for slavery and forcing them to
yeah,
live this way is probably a great moral evil. And unfortunately, some people still haven't learned that lesson. But it's the majority of people alive today don't see that as a good thing. And so I think that morals evolve as humans have evolved, and it's just part of our cumulative tradition of the knowledge and wisdom we've gained just by generation after generations.
awesome. That's it's like you said, it's an endless subject.
Yeah,
It just goes on and on. So we're actually getting close to time here. So I want to thank you for just how for the time you've been you offered here.
sure.
Last question I wanted to ask was during your sermon you gave a reading of the poem "Wild Geese" by
Mhm.
Mary Oliver, and you mentioned that it was your favorite poem. Um, this Mary Oliver's work is I've noticed has been it's pretty popular among religious naturalists. So what would you say was the kind of reason why you chose this poem, or why does it appeal to you?
Well, I'll say that, I have never encountered a Mary Oliver poem that didn't resonate with me on some
Okay,
level. She's just one of these people who had a knack for that. And I was fortunate to hear her read some of her poetry several years ago, at one of our UU General Assemblies, and just hearing her read it in her own voice is a delight. And so among Unitarian Universalism, Mary Oliver poetry is almost scripture at this point. I would say you hear it in
interesting.
a lot of churches on a lot of occasions. In fact, this past Sunday, I used a different poem, um, and and one of my congregants came up to me afterward and said, I'm really glad you used a lot of Mary Oliver because I've really connected with Mary Oliver over the years. And so I hear that a lot. I mean, and so this poem in particular, I think expresses the way Mary Oliver just got it. Her
Hmm.
theology is a little different from mine, a little more theistic, probably because she does use some, more theistic language in some of her poetry. But I think that she encountered the natural world. She spent years living in a shack and gathering mussels and things like that. So she was living very close to the earth, and so that may
Okay.
have contributed to part of her understanding. But you can tell from her poetry and the way she expresses it that she really gets the whole religious naturalist philosophy, if you will, or spirituality, and it just comes through in her poetry, and it reads so nicely and so well done that, like I said, I could pull out just about any of her poems and use them on occasion. I often use her poetry. There's a handful of others, like I'll mention, Wendell Berry's another one that
Okay.
tends to write those kind of that really get you in that at least for my personal spirituality, and so I think you can see that in Taoist sages from centuries ago, as well as, like I said, most of Mary Oliver's stuff. And so she talks in that particular poem at the end about finding, announcing your place in the family of things. And I think that's the whole, bottom line there is, experiencing humanity as part of the family of things, or
Hmm.
nature. and that great web of relationships of life, and even non-living things, just our relationship to the earth and the soil and the rocks and everything else, and the cosmos, writ large. And so when you run across a poet like that, it's very inspirational, and just, like I said, she has a way of putting in words that are better than my words. And so it's like they're great for using it in worship services, and I frequently use Mary Oliver. So.
It's like you mentioned the theology being poetry. You're
Mhm.
putting poetic words to
Absolutely.
things that we've learned about nature, and it's like I've when I came across that poem, I loved it too, and
Mhm.
I obviously need to read more for work. It sounds like.
As I said, I've never encountered a poem of hers I didn't like. So it's
Well,
she's
it's a glowing
some are
review.
shorter, some are longer, and but she has. You can find something on just about any subject that I preach on. I can usually find something in her poetry that would work if I decided to use Mary Oliver for that particular Sunday. So she's just one of those really remarkable poets, or was. But she lived a wonderful life, and just like I said, from Unitarian Universalist perspective, she's venerated on a level that I would call scripture at this point. So it's she's certainly well known, and a lot of people find inspiration.
That's awesome. Well, it's been a great conversation.
Yes.
Really appreciate this talk here. I'm glad we got the time to do this. We even went over, so again, thank you for your time.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah. So just any closing comments you want to make, or what would you anything you wanted to say that we didn't get to?
Nothing more than just, I think that I'm very hopeful that religious naturalism in some form will continue to spread and evolve, and touch people and help us reconnect with that earth human bond that is so broken in so many cases.
Hmm.
Because I think that, you're never going to convince everybody, and, I never would even assume we could. But I think that if we can convince enough people to kind of explore that connection to the earth, that's where we need to reach that tipping point to get us to something that's more sustainable. I mean, the
Yes.
question is, can we get there before it's too late? I mean, there's so many things, so many different scenarios that we can imagine that would result in mass extinction of our own species, and take half the planet with us. And so I'm hopeful, and I tend to be hopeful that when I see in the younger generations, especially, they're growing up with a deeper sense of connection to nature and
Yes.
to earth, and so I'm hoping that the more of that can get out there, and I think it's not only just beneficial for the earth and humans as a species, but it's individually beneficial for our own spiritual growth and sense of connection, and making us a whole human being. I think that it lets us really understand who we are, and what our relationships are, and why it's important. I think that we're all just better off once we start making those connections and spending more time in nature, even in small ways like we talked about. So yeah, I'm hopeful for the future, and I see more and more writers and poets and things emerging to kind of promote this kind of perspective, and so I'm very hopeful going forward.
That's awesome. It's definitely a growing awareness. Well, let's have to see how the future holds. It's definitely a prescient time to become more aware of nature and to
Absolutely.
understand our place in it. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. This has been
Oh,
great.
sure.
I'll let you know when this is posted.
Okay.
But yeah, you take care and enjoy your spring.
Oh, thanks a lot. You too.
All right. Goodbye.